Welcome back, everybody. A Quiet Place Part 2. As the title implies, it's a follow-up to A Quiet Place, which released in 2018, and like the previous film, it is written and directed by John Krasinski, and whereas in the first film, John Krasinski did direct and was involved in the writing, this time around he is fully credited as both writer and director. And if his face looks familiar, he is of the Office fame, now going into horror. So this film, this time around, actually picks up right where the last film left off. So there are going to be some spoilers here if you haven't seen the first film. If you haven't seen the first one, I highly recommend it. It was actually a pretty solid horror picture. So where the movie actually begins is we have this intro sequence that shows us on day one of the disaster. You know, when these creatures come out for the first time, and we actually see things actually falling apart before we go back to present day. And it's a surprisingly very high, suspenseful, very tense sequence as we see our main characters, the Abbott family, going through the disaster and surviving the first day. Honestly, the sequence was so good I really wanted to see more, and I'm hoping we get to see more in The Quiet Place Part 3. As for the rest of the movie, the Abbott family, now down one family member, needs to go out and find help. Because in the previous movie, the wife, still played by Emily Blunt, gave birth to a baby. Which I have to note that the fact that the baby's birth took place within an hour in the previous movie, it's not a thing that exists, so I don't know why horror films keep doing that. And I only bring it up because these movies are actually very good at showing you the smaller moments and really being detail-oriented. So that birth scene was very notably unrealistic. But that's besides the point, because that was the previous movie. So now the family needs to go and find help because they have a newborn baby, it's just two kids, and a mother trying to keep it all together. Previously, the father had been keeping track with his neighbors by lighting fires at night, and so they go to one neighbor who's still lighting his fire. And this neighbor is played by Cillian Murphy, who unfortunately is a lone survivor of his family, barely keeping, his survival. So it's one of those reluctant moments of survivors trying to meet up, not wanting to interact, but gosh darn it, they just have to, and an adventure ensues. Through Cillian's character's radio, they keep hearing the song Beyond the Sea played over and over again. It's theorized by the daughter that this is a signal of people needing help, so she becomes determined that she wants to go out on her own and try to help whoever is sending out the signal. Obviously, this seems like a really dumb idea. The mother's against it, Cillian Murphy's against it. Nonetheless, she still goes out on her own. This is the one part of the movie that drove me absolutely nuts. Look, the daughter, I get it. She's been through a lot of rough times. She probably blames herself for the death of one of her siblings, maybe even for her father. She probably feels like she needs to kind of have some kind of redemption, maybe, and she's got a lot of those teenage hormones going on for her. Nonetheless, though, some of the decisions that she makes are just outright stupid. Her character drove me nuts, and they kind of give this nod too that she's justified in some of her decisions later on, and I just can't wrap my head around the fact that it was really dumb and she would have died along the way if it weren't for Cillian Murphy's character. But of course, where the movie winds up going is splitting the characters on two different paths. The mother, son, and baby kind of keep at the base where they have to keep themselves protected in what kind of looks like a bank vault. And they take full advantage of that in some very tense sequences. And it's funny to note how the actor for the son seems much older than the previous film. Having been through a 3-year difference between the two movies, the character is clearly starting to go through puberty. So if they're going to make a part 3, I hope they make it soon, because otherwise the son's going to look much older. Cracked voice and all. And on the other path, we have Cillian Murphy and the daughter going out and trying to seek that signal. And of course, they run into some obstacles along the way, but they do find a small civilization of other people, and where they meet another main character played by Djimon Hounsou, who's always a terrific actor to watch. And this leads us to an ending that I felt like was much more sudden than the previous film. Whereas in the previous film, the film did kind of end somewhat abruptly, but at least you kind of had this revelation of, oh, okay, they figured out the monster's weaknesses. This time around, they kind of have a semi-revelation, but it's not nearly as the previous movie. So I felt like the ending was a little more underwhelming this time around, or at least it just felt like it was cut short much more abruptly. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I did feel like I needed a little more to help finish off this chapter, especially since we might be waiting, who knows, another 2 or 3 years for the next movie. But what I do have to talk about is what I love about this movie, which is the same as the previous movie, is I love the fact that, well, it's a quiet place. Because when it comes to filmmaking, I feel like movies are best when there's very little dialogue. When you're trying to tell a story in a very visual way, I feel like that's where film excels the most. And we do have a lot of those moments throughout the movie. Like, for example, the daughter winds up in a train car where she's surrounded by a bunch of cadavers, and the way they're all set up and little details kind of build a story of kind of how they all died. And it's details like that that make the movie very compelling, because you see a lot of small stories written right into the setting. The environment speaks volumes for a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of storytelling going on without outright telling the audience that something is happening. And to me, this is sort of the brilliance of the medium. And I feel like these two movies do a very good job capturing that quietness and taking full advantage of the visual storytelling. So when it comes down to it being a horror movie, I wouldn't necessarily call it scary as I would some other horror movies. I know that's always subjective, but my main thing is I do feel like the movie is very tense. There's a lot of suspense, there's a lot of tension built throughout these sequences. It's a little more action heavy to be considered a very scary movie, but you are rooting for these characters all the way through the movie. And that's why I think this is a pretty solid movie. I do think the second movie has the disadvantage of being the follow-up because it's not going to surprise us in the same way as the first film. We hadn't seen a movie like that being made in quite a while, and therefore it was actually a pretty effective horror movie. So this time around I feel like there is more that's explored within this world, and the rules that are sort of established in this new kind of community because of, you know, these weird alien creature things. Which I love the fact they don't give us too much information about these monsters, because overall I think they're actually kind of irrelevant. Yeah, they're sort of these weird ear kind of creatures, but the fact of the matter is we don't really need to know where they're from, because this is really about our characters surviving a very difficult situation. It's kind of like Walking Dead, I guess, in that sense. It's not really about the zombies, it's about the people in the situation. But it's a unique situation where they can't talk, they have to be quiet, and that's what kind of leads to some really great tense scenes. So what I'm getting at is that this is a very well thought out concept that I think made for a very effective horror movie. So with that said, I do think A Quiet Place Part 2 gets my score of 3.5 stars. Guys, thanks as always for watching. Have you all seen A Quiet Place Part 2 or its predecessor? And are you excited for Part 3? And if you haven't seen any of those movies, what else have you been watching lately? Comment below, let me know, and stay tuned right here if you all want to see more.